All right, folks, it's that time. Welcome to another exciting edition of Climate Science on Tap. Climate Science in the courtroom. Are you guys excited? Oh gosh, that was sad. How about this? Are you guys excited? All right, how about those of you who have been to a Climate Science on Tap before? Are you excited? How about those of you who are new to Climate Science on Tap? Are you excited? If you are going to come to Climate Science on Tap, you need to be excited. New people, are you excited? All right, that's better, that's better. Okay, guys, my name is Sean McDonald, and I'm your moderator for this evening. I am from the University of Washington, program on climate change, program on the environment. I associate with the program on climate change. I am here to moderate the session for tonight. I want to go ahead and just give a quick shout out to the folks we have in store for you tonight. Andrea Rogers, Pete Erickson, and Steve Gardner. Are you excited to hear from them? Yes, of course you are. They're going to be great. Couple of things I want to mention before we get started. You know, Seattleites get a bad rap for being passive, right? You guys heard this? We're passive on the dating scene. You guys have heard about the Seattle freeze, right? That's a thing. We're passive at stop signs, right? That's a thing. You're not going to be passive tonight, okay? You're not going to be passive tonight. We're about action. We're going to give you some ways to be active and take action for climate change. First thing you're going to do is you're going to ask questions. If you have questions for our panelists tonight, fill out a comment card on your table. These little 3x5 cards, everybody's got them on their table. Please fill it out. If you have a question for any of our panelists at any time, we will be collecting these when we get to our point in the evening when we do our moderated discussion. So please, 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 ask your questions. You can ask them of the group, or later after we break, you can ask them individually. You'll have a chance for that too. Also, check out CascadiaClimateAction.org. It's your one-stop shop for everything related to climate change in our area, so check it out. And then lastly, I just want to give a plug to our groups who are tabling tonight. We got some groups over here that we'll talk a little bit more about later. We've got Cascadia Climate Action's table over there. You can go and talk to them as well. So before you leave tonight, I want you to really think critically about the action you're going to take. I expect to hear from each and every one of you that you're taking some action. All right. Thank you for that. Okay, so without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker for this evening. Andrea Rogers received her law degree from Arizona State University in 2001. She has served as an honors attorney for the U.S. Department of Transportation, in-house legal counsel for the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe, and staff attorney for the Western Environmental Law Center. Her environmental law practice focuses on reducing pollution from industrial agriculture operations, protecting and enhancing in-stream flows for people and fish, and fighting climate change on behalf of young people and future generations. That's pretty impressive. In 2016, Seattle Met Magazine recognized her legal work representing youth in the Washington Atmospheric Trust litigation case in King County Superior Court. That was against Washington Department of Ecology. And named her, get this, named her, this is impressive, part of their perfect party, which includes the month's most interesting locals and newsmakers. I have never been anyone's most interesting party person. That's really impressive. So without further ado, let's give it up for Andrea Rogers, our party person.
Yeah, okay, and I'm loud naturally. Yeah, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me.
You want to use this? Laser is the middle, right side advances.
Right advances, okay.
I'll give you the 5 minutes.
Okay. All right, you guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Sean. And this is awesome to have so many people here on a Wednesday evening to talk about climate change. I'm a lawyer. I represent 21 young people in a case against the federal government called Juliana versus United States. My goal tonight, though, is I'm not going to talk about the law, which is a good thing because our case is crazy when it comes to the procedural legal history of what's going on. What I will say is right now our case is in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. This is the 6th time we have been in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. We have been in the Supreme Court twice, and we are waiting to get to trial. We had an October 29th trial date. We have all of our experts were all ready to testify. The 21 youth were ready to testify, and we were stayed by the Supreme Court 10 days before trial started. The stay was lifted November 2nd, but then the Ninth Circuit decided to hear these legal questions in an early appeal. We just filed our answering brief in that. We will be arguing that the first week of June in Portland. You must be there. The other thing that we recently did, which is probably the most exciting thing, is we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction. And the reason we did that is because our trial has been delayed. So we have asked the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal to stop all new coal leasing and extraction on federal public lands, stop all extraction on the Outer Continental Shelf, and stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure projects. There's about 100 that are in the pipeline. So we're asking that they put a pause on all of those until our claims are heard in a court of law. We submitted about 13 declarations, including one from Peter Erickson, who you'll hear from later tonight, along with Dr. Joseph Stiglitz and other experts. And do you know how much evidence they submitted in response to our preliminary injunction motion? Nothing. Nothing. They cited 2 websites in response. I've been practicing law for almost 20 years. I have never seen a response to a preliminary injunction contain no evidence. And the reason it has no evidence is because they know when they get to the facts, they're gonna lose. So this is gonna be really exciting when we argue this motion. So enough about the law. Now I wanna talk about the science. So here's a little bit about what we're gonna be proving. In November of 2016, we obtained a wonderful decision from Judge Ann Aiken, who's our judge in the case in the District of Oregon. And this is, it's a beautiful opinion. If you haven't read it, you must do so. But she talked about where a complaint alleges governmental action is affirmatively and substantially damaging the climate system. That's the first part of our proof. We need to show that the government here is responsible. And we're going to prove that they have known for decades of the climate danger, and in spite of that knowledge, they have persisted in their conduct of pursuing a fossil fuel-based energy system that is harming the youth plaintiffs. Here's how she framed it. Our claims are constitutional in nature. We don't have a statutory claim. Our claims are solely based on the United States Constitution. So let's get into the science a little bit. One thing that's really interesting about our case is the vast majority of our science about how the planet is warming, the energy imbalance, sea level rise, ice melt, none of that is contested by the federal government. They were not able to find a witness to say that climate change isn't happening. So even though you hear that from the Oval Office, they have no evidence to present of that in court. So that's not really at play in the United States court cases dealing with climate change. Here's just a little bit of the history. You guys have seen this. One of our experts is Dr. Jim Hansen. And what he did in his expert report was he explained to the courts, because they need to understand how this works, right? So he explained what it means that the Earth is out of energy balance, and how that happens, and the physical principles associated with that. And part of that is, the rising levels of carbon dioxide concentrations. And the other part of Dr. Hansen's report that is really critical for the claims in our case is he goes through the history of the scientific knowledge. So this, climate change is not a new phenomenon that suddenly people all of a sudden understood. The science has been developed over a period of time, like all scientific disciplines are, right? You gain more understanding and more information. But much of the general principles underlying the critical climate science have been known for decades. And that's a really important part, because that's what brings us to how we get the government liable here. This is one of my favorite graphs because there's a lot to learn from the history of planet Earth. We have never warmed the planet like we're doing right now. We have never done that in the past, but one of our experts is Dr. Harold Wanless, and he is a geologist at the University of Miami, and we learned a lot from him because he knows and understands how seas have risen in the past. And that's very important for us to understand so that we know what we're seeing, the sea level that we're seeing now, we can sort of predict what it's going to be doing, not just based on models, but based on what we understand from the past. And you can see here from this graph the close link, the correlation between CO2 concentrations, global temperature, and sea level rise. So you can see when the CO2 concentrations rise, and like I said, they're going off the charts like we've never seen before, we're going to have temperature increase, and we're also going to have sea level rise. And this is, part of the science of our case is, as a lawyer representing children, it's very difficult to read this part of the science. And I'll just be honest with you, when you see what the reality is that we're facing, the emergency becomes very, very clear. And our challenge is, how do we get the court to understand the emergency that it is, right? Most climate change decisions will see the science and say, okay, well, let's wait for the legislature, let's wait for the executive. I cannot emphasize enough the urgency and the emergency that we're in. And if you leave with one thing tonight, know that this is an emergency and start treating it as an emergency. Talk to people about it as an emergency. And that's really, really important. And here's one example why. This is the last time CO2 concentrations were above 400 parts per million. This is what our planet looked like. I'm right now briefing our case in Florida, where the government there, they don't mention climate change in 100 pages of briefing. We have a big way to go, but this is extremely significant and scary. Our sea level rise expert has projected sea levels to rise about 15 to 30 feet by the end of the century, which is higher than most projections. The highest NOAA projection is about 8 feet. But interestingly, the federal government has produced no expert to contest his testimony. So we'll be able to establish that and get that as a finding of fact once we get to trial. The other very difficult expert report to read is Dr. Eric Rigno. He's an amazing scientist who knows a tremendous amount about glaciers and ice melt. And why this is probably a good explanation of the emergency that we face. Because of the warming that has happened to date, a lot of the ice melt that we're staring at is irreversible. So we can't stop it. So we're going to be facing a certain amount of sea level rise. And, as lawyers, you're sort of, do we need to say that? We need to be able to solve the problem, but we can't change what the science says. So we need to provide this to the court and explain this is why it's urgent, but it's not why the court should sit by and do nothing, right? So that's our job in the legal arguments. But the ice is melting tremendously. The science that's coming out on ice melt is coming out like gangbusters. I feel like every week there's a new study coming out on Greenland or Antarctica. There's so much work being done in this field, and our expert reports that were prepared 8 months ago they get to be out of date. So as soon as we get back on trial track, we will have to update those with the new evidence that's happening. But I will say, ice melt, it's always more severe than they thought it was, which is very concerning. Another really interesting new study is about our oceans. Our oceans absorb about 93.4% of the heat. They've been our savior. If we didn't have the oceans, the heat would have gone someplace else. But they've absorbed a tremendous amount of heat, which is not a good thing because they're getting to their capacity. A new study just came out in January that one of our experts, Dr. Kevin Trenberth, participated in, and they found that the oceans are warming at more significantly and at a greater pace than previously anticipated, 5 times greater than the rate of warming through the 70s and 80s. This is very, very, very concerning. And they were very surprised to see that. And we have the data that they use now to measure the oceans, the temperature of the oceans is getting very, very sophisticated. So we're getting much more precise on the information. But the consequences of our warming ocean is tremendous and devastating. And this is an aspect of climate change that, again, communicates the urgency. We don't have, the defense have not produced an expert to contest this scientific information that we're presenting. I don't have I love coral reefs and the marine ecosystems, and so I don't want to show you a picture of dying reefs because it's very difficult to see. So I have a cartoon to try to make it more palatable. But again, our expert on ocean acidification is a man named Dr. Ove Goldberg, who's at the University of Queensland. And if you've seen the film Chasing Coral, he's in that film. And what he talks about is the ramifications to coral reefs and those of society who depend upon coral reefs, which is billions and billions of people. And the impacts to reefs that we're seeing are happening now, and they're tremendously severe. As I was just talking about in Florida, the sad part of Florida is they are just about at the tipping point. The water is so warm there that they fear the reefs may not be able to recover in Florida. The economic consequences of that to that state, huge. The moral consequences, the ethical consequences that we'll hear Steve talk about, tremendous. And we are at the brink of collapse of our coral reef ecosystems because of the warmth of the water and the acidity that's happening. So Dr. Goldberg really talks about the urgency of drawing down carbon dioxide emissions immediately. And these are treasures. Any of you who've been under the water on a reef know what a special, special place that is. And for us to not be able to leave that to our children, it's very, very powerful. And it's something that's particularly devastating to our plaintiffs. We have a plaintiff who's in Hawaii, and we have a plaintiff who lives in Florida. They're very connected to these places in a number of different ways. Now, we have a number of experts who are physicians. And this is probably some of our strongest injury impacts because these are effects that are happening today. We're not saying that, in 50 years their house is going to be inundated. We're talking about their health today. And you know this because you live in Seattle and you've been here the last 2 Augusts and have felt the craziness of seeing an orange ball through the smoke. Because of the wildfire, and that's what these kids are living with. These are 3. This is Avery on the left, Hazel in the middle, and Sahara on the right. They live in Eugene. Were unable to go to school, unable to do activities. Their asthma was made much more significant. They had worse asthma attacks. And, while that happens on a day-to-day level, what the medical expert says is that really consigns them to health problems later in life. And that's something that's very difficult to get out of. So we have physicians who are talking about these health impacts, not only to the plaintiffs in particular, but to the population at large. And children are particularly vulnerable when it comes to this. I think another one of our experts, her name is Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, and she's a mental health expert. She's a psychiatrist who's been in practice for many, many, many years. And she has written a tremendous expert report explaining about the psychological impacts of climate change. And it's very difficult for young people today, as you know, on many, many issues. But for those who are particularly aware of climate change and aware of the fact that they have a government and a president who is actively pursuing policies that they know causes the harm, it's very difficult for these kids to have faith in their democracy and their government. And that's what our society is about educating kids to be participating democratic citizens. And so the emotional harm from this institutional failure is very, very, very significant. So we have a tremendous amount of evidence about that. And bless these kids, they talk about it. It's hard, but they talk about it. They've been deposed about it, about the nightmares that they have, the depression that they're experiencing, the anxiety. So it's a very real part of their reality, and, they're not alone in that, but it's tremendously important. This is for the historians out there. We have a historian as one of our experts because we need to prove that there's a fundamental right as an attribute of your liberty as an American to a stable climate system. In order to show that, we have to show that the Founding Fathers actually cared about nature and understood the connection and the importance of preserving our beautiful land. Well, fortunately, we have very good historical evidence. This is just an example. This is James Madison, a speech he gave after he was president. And we have a historian, her name is Andrea Wolfe, and you must read her book called Founding Gardeners. And it talks about how our founding fathers were first and foremost farmers. They cared about the soil, they cared about the trees, because that's what they wanted the nation to be founded upon. They wanted a nation of farmers. So she talks about that history. So that's a big part of our case. This quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Pete Erickson, who you'll hear from, he's an expert on greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Well, this man led an inventory of the whole nation's natural resources to figure out what bounty we had in this great land. And he recognized the importance of preserving it for future generations. So there's a example. And then as we get into more modern history, this is really where the fun begins. So you've heard of Exxon Knew, right? And the work that's been done on the fossil fuel industries and what they knew and when they knew it. We've done that, but for the federal government, what they knew and when they knew it. They knew a lot. One of our experts, his name is Gus Speth. He's written a tremendous amount of books. He was at CEQ in the Carter administration and other administrations that followed. And he takes you through the walk through all of the administrations and their choice to pursue fossil fuels instead of pursuing renewables, even though there were multiple opportunities to transition off. Here's just a few examples. You'll see, they really had a fairly good understanding of what the science was, but of course it evolves. And so we need to tell that story to the court, and we're doing that through this historical evidence and assessment. And Dr. Hansen also provides evidence on this. He was, one of the first to testify in Congress in the 80s about climate change, and he had a number of experiences within the government, so his testimony will go to show that. Here's some, a White House memo talking about. And I like this one because it says, this could increase the average temperature near the Earth's surface by 7 degrees Fahrenheit. This, in turn, could raise the level of the sea by 10 feet. Goodbye, New York. Goodbye, Washington, for that matter. We have no data on Seattle. Well, Ehrlichman was from Seattle, so that was why they were interested in data on Seattle. We now have data on Seattle. But why I think this is important, that 7 degrees number. So when Trump did the rollback of the motor vehicle standards, right, what they found was, this will just allow us to increase the temperature by 7 degrees. I'm like, I've heard that number before, and it's not good. But now that's something that the current administration is actively espousing. Deliberate indifference, right? That's our evidence. Here's a little bit of the timeline that we have. I mean, there's great stuff in the history. EPA had a plan to get carbon dioxide emissions down to 350 parts per million in 1990. Part of it was a carbon tax, $123 or something like that. You know, they had the whole plan, they had all of the policies put aside and rejected. It's really amazing. As early as 79, a wait-and-see policy may mean waiting until it is too late. And we have evidence to support all of this, and we'll be getting in all of these documents. The vast majority of our evidence is federal government documents, which is great because they're their own documents, so try to impeach those. One of the challenges that we have in this case, and this is where Pete's testimony is so important, why should we hold the U.S. responsible? Other nations are emitting. You'll hear talk about China. That's their latest thing. It's China. That's their latest argument that they've just raised. But, you know, the United States is the big dog. They got us here, and this is where it's important, the cumulative emissions. And Pete can explain more about that, but because of the carbon dioxide, their long-lived nature in the atmosphere, what we did in the past matters. It doesn't just go away. We need to be responsible for what we did because that's the crisis that we created. And you get into all sorts of questions about ethics and equity when you're dealing with that. And we do our best to incorporate that into our case, which is difficult because we have emitted so much. It's very difficult to bring equity in because it would make the reductions so significant. So the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes, which is a travesty. Again, this is the happy story. You know, it's like I said, dealing with the other expert reports, absolutely depressing. And as lawyers, we're in that sick place where we're like, oh, great, another study, more sea level rise, you know, because we see it as evidence. So when we become human again and we close our laptops, which is not frequent, the good part is when we meet with our remedy guys. This is where it gets fun because there's solutions to all of these problems. And we are fortunate to work with several people who have done the math and have done the engineering to look at how do we decarbonize the United States of America. It is feasible, folks. It is very feasible. The only thing that the experts really quibble over is the pathway. How do you do it, and what are the best policies? But they agree it can be done. Even the defendants' experts agree it can be done. They just fight over what it would look like. That's so important to understand, is that it's feasible. And we asked one of our experts, Jim Williams at Evolved Energy Research. He worked on the deep decarbonization, if you've heard that, looking at how do you reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Well, the science folks that we work say 80% by 2050 does not preserve a habitable climate system. That allows too much warming to occur. So when you hear 80% by 2050, frown, say no, say it's ridiculous. We don't want to go halfway to the moon, right? So we asked him the question that's never asked, said no, we want to get to 350 parts per million by the end of the century. That's what our experts tell us will preserve coral reefs, preserves most of the ice sheets, protect the rights of young people. So we asked them, can you do that? Can you run your models? And it was wonderful. It was hard for them. It was very, very hard work because they had to figure out, well, how do you cut here? What do we do with cement? God, cement, airlines. These are challenging things. But they did it. They created the model. It's feasible. It's going to be peer-reviewed research that's coming out in the next couple of months. If you're fortunate to go to Eugene, Oregon this weekend to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, they have their panel, which is called Deeper Decarbonization, and they will be presenting their research. So it's super exciting to see. Now, as part of our case, the court will never order what policies will need to be implemented, right? That's not what the court does. The court will just say, thou shalt protect the constitutional rights of young people. And then it will be up to the other branches of government to figure out how to do that. Green New Deal, we've heard of that. Those are the kind of policies that need to be preserved. But the court needs to tell us what needs to be done to protect these kids. They make the backstop, okay? So this is what's so exciting. The other part that's really fun is the amount of sequestration that can be done in this country. It's fascinating. We work with an expert named Philip Robertson. He's in Michigan, and he found this problem fascinating because Dr. Hansen, in his prescription to get to 350, we need to plant millions and millions of trees and increase our carbon sequestration. And how do we do that? Can we do that through natural methods? And he did all of the math and all of the accounting to figure out what can be done. And there's a tremendous amount of sequestration that can be accomplished in this country through improved forestry practices, through improved agricultural practices, planting trees. A tremendous amount can be done. We just don't have the policies in place to do it. But that needs to change, and that's part of the conversation that needs to happen. It's not just about reducing emissions. We're late, we're too slow, so we have to really focus on this carbon sequestration as well. And here's what I talked about. This is the science that scientists are working on. How do we preserve, how do we restore an energy balance? It's a physical problem. It's a physical phenomena that they have looked at and come up with solutions. The problem with policy and legislators, even here in the state of Washington, Governor Inslee, who's a climate champion in many, many ways, they're not talking about this science. So when you talk to people and ask for climate action, make sure that it's based on science, because that's what's going to protect the young people. Nothing less than that. Don't compromise on that. And here's what it is, here where we need to go. It's getting very, very difficult and very, very steep. This is going to be a challenge like none of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes. So get ready, because it's going to happen. And again, here's just a little bit more, some more graphics on how it gets done, which is the exciting aspect of that. And I'll close with that. It's a little complicated, but it's exciting to see that people have done that. So that's a little bit about our sort of the scientific experts. I haven't talked about every single one. We have expert reports. They've been filed with the court, so they're publicly available. It's amazing to see the science in that way. It's just our job to get in the courtroom door. We are fighting every day to do that. So please stay tuned, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about what it was like to put these witnesses on the stand, because it will be a very exciting day when we do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Just go ahead and stay put. In fact, you can go ahead and have a seat right there if you will. So at this point, folks, you've had a chance to hear a little bit about the work that Andrea Rogers is doing. If you have questions for Andrea, please write them down on the cards. Our volunteers will be collecting them shortly. If you have any questions about the lawsuits, about the science, about the ethics, the justice issues, you'll have a chance to get those answered here in a second. I want to go ahead and invite the rest of our panelists up to the stage now. The next person I'm going to introduce is Pete Erickson. He's a scientist and climate policy researcher at the Seattle office of the Stockholm Environment Institute. His research focuses on the connection between fossil fuel infrastructure and climate change, with a particular interest in how continued investment in oil pipelines, oil and gas fields, coal mines, and fossil fuel export terminals lock us in to a high carbon economy. His research on these topics has been published in scientific journals such as Nature Climate Change, Nature Energy, Environmental Research Letters, Climate Change, Energy Policy, and Climate Policy. Those are all really good journals. I wish I could get published in those journals. He first got interested in climate change in elementary school when his teacher asked him to research record high and low temperatures in his hometown of Moline, Illinois, which is awesome. When I was in elementary school, my science fair project was about a papier-mâché volcano, and I never got it to work, so that's pretty impressive. So let's give it up for Pete Erickson. And our last panelist is Steve Gardner. He's a professor of philosophy and the Ben Rabinowitz Endowed Professor of on the human dimensions of the environment at the University of Washington, where he is also the director of the program on values in society. His research focuses on global environmental problems, future generations, and virtue ethics. Steve is the author of A Perfect Moral Storm, The Ethical Tragedy of Climate Change, as well as Debating Climate Ethics, a for and against book on climate justice with David Weisbach. Steve has a casual interest in breweries. That's why we invited him here tonight. He once wrote an essay about all the pubs his grandfather took him to on vacation. His mother discovered it on his classroom wall at an open house. He was in kindergarten at the time. So he's been studying pubs almost as long as climate ethics. So let's give it up for Steve Gardner as well. I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay. Well, we're going to take some questions, but I was hoping first both Pete and Steve are just going to give a little bit of discussion. I did not talk about Pete's expert report because we're lucky enough to have him here. So he's going to talk a little bit about how the scientific work that he does and the studies that he does, how does he put that into an expert report that we then turn into court and it becomes testimony. So he'll give a little bit of experience on that.
Thanks, Andrea. Well, I am just honored to be a part of this lawsuit, and as Andrea said, I am a scientist, and my work is on the fossil fuel economy, essentially how the fossil fuel economy contributes to climate change and what to do about it. So the research I do and publish in scientific journals was actually very easy to transfer to this case because the case is making some very basic claims, I think, about the federal government's role and the United States' role in climate change. The three big topics that my research addressed and that transferred over to the case were around, the first is just around U.S. responsibility for emissions. Cumulatively over history, U.S. has emitted, roughly a fifth of all global greenhouse gas emissions, more than any other country. And that fact alone puts us in a very critical, important leadership position in terms of how to deal with the problem and also responsibility for what we've done to the world and to people in outlying and low-lying areas all around the world that are going to be threatened. So that's the first aspect. Also, our role in emissions is more than just what the U.S. emits from within our borders, right? We import massive quantities of goods and services from other regions that are producing those for us and releasing emissions in our name, essentially. So our responsibility is even greater than our own emissions. The second major topic of my research that transferred over to the case was around the federal lands, just specifically the public lands and waters of all people in the United States produce about, again, a fifth of all national emissions each year. So from the coal in the Powder River Basin, that's coming from federal lands, that's 40% of all U.S. coal, to the oil that's coming from the Gulf of Mexico, that's about a fifth of all U.S. oil. Those are coming from public resources owned by the public that don't need to be used in this way. The last area of my research that transferred over to the case was around subsidies, around the tax policy for the fossil fuel industry. There are big subsidies to oil and gas and also to coal, but especially to oil and gas that have been in place for a century, 100 years. Essentially, companies can write off to a large degree their capital investments in oil and gas infrastructure. That allows them to drill and drill and drill with little consequence because they can always get the financing and they can always just, if it sounds like a pyramid scheme, it kind of is. So those are 3 topics. They all translate directly to things that could be done going forward in terms of policy, and we can talk about more perhaps in the question answer.
Okay, thank you all for coming out, and thank you to everybody for being here and for the invitation. I want to start out with a small disagreement with something that Andrea said, but I think ultimately she won't disagree with me. I hope so anyway. Andrea said, we need to pay attention to the science, keep going back to the science. And although I agree with that to an extent, I actually think this is fundamentally an ethical issue for us, right? Science informs what our ethical responsibilities are here, but really it's about what are those responsibilities, how do we discharge them, and what do we do about the fact that we're failing woefully at the moment in discharging those responsibilities. So here are some ways in which the issue is really an ethical issue, I think. One is that the fundamental things that are at stake are ethical, right? We need to protect the current generation, future generations, non-human life against severe climate impacts. The need to protect those things is an ethical need, right? It's a moral responsibility that we have. Law sometimes does a good job of translating our moral responsibilities into law and therefore helping us fulfill them. But one of the issues here is it's failing, right? Our political institutions are failing, but the law is currently failing us as well, and the lawsuit and others like it are trying to remedy that failure. And I think that is a very worthy and noble pursuit. Another reason why the issue, you can see the issue is ethical, is that when we talk about the science, sometimes the focus is on whether things are certain or not. Well, that's actually a funny kind of focus, because most things that we make decisions about are not certain, at least not certain in a very strong sense. So it could not possibly be false, right? We make huge life decisions all the time, what kind of career to have, who to marry, whether to have kids, all these kinds of things, right? Do we make those decisions under conditions of certainty about what's going to happen? No, we don't, right? So I think a better way to look at the thing around the science is not certainty, but what are the risks here, right? And the risks are really a bit like, as some people have said in the ethics literature, it's a bit like we're playing Russian roulette. And we're arguing about whether there are 4, 5, or 6 bullets in the chamber. That's what we're arguing about, right? Where the salient fact is there are way too many bullets in these chambers. We should do something about this. And the other salient thing there is we keep talking about Russian roulette as if we're playing it on ourselves. But we're playing it on other people around the world, and especially future generations, right? So we shouldn't be arguing about, is it 4, 5, or 6 bullets? Really shouldn't be arguing about that. And it's a real ethical problem to make the argument about certainty about whether it's 4, 5, or 6 as an excuse. The final aspect I want to emphasize of it being an ethical problem is, yes, there are effects in the near term, but there are much bigger effects in the long term, right? Things are getting bad on the ground in various ways, the smoke, the fires every summer, but that's only at a degree on average of temperature rise, right? We're talking about a scenario where we could go up to 4 or 5. 4 to 5 is like an ice age shift, but in the warmer direction. It's like we're suddenly deciding, we'll turn back the clock to the middle of the ice age. Things were very different around Seattle and other US cities around the ice age. I think there was about 1 kilometer of ice above us, right? If we go in the warmer direction, chances are things are going to be really different around here, right? And Yes, we'll worry about the coral reefs and we'll worry about the wildfires, but if we really let this problem run, that's going to seem like the good old days, right? That's the magnitude of risk we're doing. So there's a real ethical issue around why are we taking such risks? And a big part of the problem is many of the impacts are intergenerational. Bad things are probably going to happen over the next few decades, worse than the wildfires and some of the things with the coral reefs. But the really bad things are much more likely to happen, 2070, 2100, around that period. And so you ask yourself, why are we doing so badly over time in dealing with this problem? Here's a really obvious answer. It's because the class of people who are most likely to be severely affected by this right now are really young or have very little political power and have very little standing in the legal system. That's what the court case is trying to deal with. It's a structural, institutional problem. It's been there for a long time, but climate change throws it into sharp relief. And my view is things like the court case are a very positive move in trying to deal with that structural problem. But in the end, it's going to be the ethical responsibility of the current generation to fix that problem and start protecting the future seriously, and not free riding on the future by continuing to take short-term benefits in terms of lots of fossil fuel use, knowing that the worst costs are coming much later. They're hoping that they come when they're dead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Steve. Thank you, all of you, for your comments. I really appreciate that. Well, y'all, as I mentioned already, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to write them down on the cards. Our volunteers are collecting them and feeding them to me. I'm going to start real quickly, because this is Climate Science on Tap. I want to start with a science-y question for Pete. Based on your involvement in climate court cases, how challenging has it been to translate climate science, which can be fairly complicated, into sort of legalese, if you will? How do we make that jump? How do we talk about things like uncertainty in science? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for the work that I've been doing, I thankfully do not have to translate any uncertainty in the atmosphere into legalese. I mean, the work that I'm doing in my expert testimony is based on stuff I've already done that's already been peer reviewed. I can be pretty confident in the statements I'm making. I think the uncertainty in the scientific domain and in the climate system, the way that plays in is well, I would reference something Stephen said, which is that things are and likely going to get very bad in the future, and so from an uncertainty perspective, it's these fat tails in the probability distribution. It's things we need to plan for things getting really bad, and we need an effort that rises to that scale. I think that's one of the things that's inspiring about the case, is it's recognizing that scale.
Okay, great, thank you. I had a question. I think we have several law students in the audience, and so this question is for Andrea. So one of the audience members asked, when or how did the strategy swing towards based on constitutional rights law rather than sort of pollution mitigation or something like that, sort of Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, in regards to sort of traditional environmental cases that we've seen based on the statutes from the 60s and 70s, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, those are one-offs. So they could have never been able to crack the climate change problem, because it's not one power plant that causes the injury. It's the system. It's the fossil fuel energy system that collectively causes the harm. Our statutory environmental laws are not well suited for that kind of big problem. It's much more like before we had our statutory environmental laws, we had nuisance. And so all of the early environmental cases in the 1800s and the early 1900s, those were nuisance cases, right? And that's sort of more well suited for our situation. And how we came to the constitutional theory was we lost. You know, our first approach that we took was to sue governments for failing to act on climate change. And we lost those cases, but those losses were very, very important because it made us realize, you know, we can't sue the government for failing, for sitting around and doing nothing. The government can always sit around and do nothing and be not held accountable for that. Vote them out of office. But the government cannot actively violate constitutional rights. And so that's when we changed our approach, is when the courts told us you can't sue for failing to do something. You can sue them if they've actively violated constitutional rights. And our cases are inspired by the cases like Brown versus Board of Education, Brown versus Plata, the prison reform cases, very similar to McCleary here in Washington, which everybody knows about. And that's where, you know, the government is taking affirmative action to harm people. And so that's why we came up with that theory. But for the law students, you'll lose a lot, but you learn the most from your losses. You have to figure out, you know, what's your new approach. That's how the law works. You build on one loss after another. And maybe you'll get a little victories in there, but you know, I think a good example of that is the treaty fishing rights here in the Northwest. They've been litigating their treaty rights for 200 years and recently got a fabulous victory in the United States Supreme Court. But there's been 200 years of litigation over that. So we don't have that luxury of time in ours, but hopefully we got it right this time.
Great, thank you. So a question for Steve. So you've called climate change a perfect moral storm, and I'm actually kind of curious if you can expand on that, but also a profound ethical failure, which you sort of hit on already in your comments. I think in your book you talk about calling governments to account and calling institutions of power to account. Do you think this lawsuit is the most appropriate means, these lawsuits are the most appropriate means for doing that? Or are there other things that we as citizens should be doing to call institutions of power to account?
Yeah, so the idea of the perfect moral storm is it rests on this analogy. The people know the book, and probably more so the George Clooney movie, The Perfect Moral Storm. It's based on a true story where a fishing boat was caught at sea at the intersection of three independently powerful storms, any one of which might be strong enough to sink it, but when they all came together, it was doomed. Right? They didn't survive, either in the movie or in real life. So my metaphor is that when we come to a problem like climate change, we're at the intersection of some really serious challenges to our ability to behave ethically. There are major temptations to behave badly when these things come together. So the most obvious thing is that the problem's genuinely global. So you get paralysis around the US blames China, China blames the US, and everybody feels good about not doing anything, right? But I've highlighted the intergenerational dimension, because most of the analysis around the global dimension takes it for granted that individual countries agree that the best thing to do is to limit sharply climate change. And I say, well, from an intergenerational perspective, maybe not. Maybe they don't, right? Maybe the generations don't agree on the level of action. And so if you've got a situation where it's the older generations that are in charge, there's going to be a temptation for the older generations to take short-term goodies and impose longer-term costs on the future. Worse than that, it's going to turn out that that arises for every generation. So though maybe the young people start out, like when my generation was younger, might start out idealistic and want to do more about the future, they get more complacent as they get older because they're not facing those negative costs. and I claim we don't have the institutions to deal with that. I also claim that in the presence of this kind of problem, there's a heavy temptation to find ways of thinking and talking about climate change as a problem that disguise those ethical aspects, right? I call this the problem of moral corruption. When I first wrote about this 20 years ago, people were like, what are you talking about, moral corruption? Now everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Because everybody thinks, okay, we know about the corruption of the way people think and talk in the public sphere. We know about fake news. We know about, deeply misleading, manipulating ways of describing things. It's part of the way we talk. And I say we've been vulnerable to that for a long time around climate change. And regrettably, even within climate policy, we succumb to that. Sometimes we describe agreements as huge successes internationally when really they're not. Kyoto was not a huge success. Paris is not a huge success. We're falling woefully short, but we're not being honest about it, and therefore we're not highlighting that that's a concern. Sorry, I got distracted. I remember there was a key question about what do I like about this, and then
just are there other things that we should be thinking about it to hold these institutions to account, or is the lawsuit, or is the courtroom really our best option, our best approach?
I think it's one powerful tool, but it will take a while. If and when it succeeds, or some version of it succeeds, it should have a dramatic effect, right? Just as victories around civil rights and other things have had dramatic effects, but it takes time. I think it would be foolish to rely only on it. We need swift action at all levels, right? We've got to decarbonize in 30 years, preferably less, right? And if we keep emitting at our current very high levels, we're going to exhaust the budget for up until 2050 very quickly, right? And so we can't wait just for lawsuits. We need action politically, obviously, right, in particular countries. We need institution building around institutions that will actually deliver for future generations, and particularly on carbon. And we need individuals and people who have power at every level of society to do whatever they can, whatever best fits their talents, to bring those emissions down, right? And many people do have some ability to influence some area where they are, and some people make profound differences there. We need all of that and probably more, right? This is the challenge of our generation, in my view, right? My personal opinion is we're in a situation right now that's a little bit like the run-up to World War II, when there was an awful lot of denial about what was going to happen, right? There were a few people who were saying, this is going to get really bad really quickly, and other people dismissed them as alarmists, but they were right. And I think we have even more solid evidence that the climate change is a big threat than the people in the 30s did about the rise of fascism. This is the time, this is our moment. The gauntlet, the world has thrown the gauntlet down to us. We have to do it, right? In some ways, it's not pretty, but on the other hand, it's good to have something to do, right? It's good to have a challenge, right? We could all sit around and watch Netflix for the next 50 years, and that'd be sort of fun, but, let's do this instead.
Thank you, Steve. I'm not going to hold it against you that you just spoiled a perfect storm for everyone in the audience. George Clooney dies. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Hey. We don't have time for many more questions. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but there are a couple of key questions, I think, about the case, Andrea. I think one of the law students in the audience asked this one. Sounds like a very legal question. Are there any current or pending court cases or policies that are acting as a counter or direct opposition to your case? In other words, is there legal risk that the local, state, or federal government would be forbidden from regulating greenhouse gas emissions or addressing climate change? Can you think of any examples?
That's against our case?
Yes.
I can't think of any. There have been attorneys who have brought similar cases with bad facts that may prove a problem when they get bad law from their bad facts. But I don't, that's an interesting question, though, about the federal government and the state government, because we have cases against the federal government, but we also have cases against the state government, because the different entities play different roles in molding their energy systems. And where I think the state cases is really unique is, how they do their transportation systems always plays a big role in our state cases. But I can't think of any legal precedent. There's a lot going on in the climate litigation world, and our hope is always, just to build off of what Steve said, the litigation is a small part of the movement, and the movement needs to be building off of each other in a positive way. So our hope is that when people bring cases, they don't bring cases that undercut others, because that's just not a successful way of making a difference.
Great, thank you, Andrea. So someone asked about a carbon tax. Obviously, we talked a lot about carbon taxes over the last year, 2 years, several years. Seattle, we've been talking about carbon taxes forever, it seems like. Is a carbon tax, I guess this is a question for Pete, is a carbon tax is that a good or helpful way for us to start addressing these issues?
Yes.
Yes. It's a short answer. That's what I like. To the point, yes.
Is it sufficient? Probably not. I mean, not unless it's $200-300 a ton, which is not really what's on the table. But short answer was
okay,
yes.
So if it's not enough, carbon tax along with what? What other solutions do we need?
Well, I personally am looking to a lot of inspiration in the Green New Deal recently. I don't know if who's looked at that and read it online, right? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC's resolution. That is a reframe of this problem to one that is where equity and climate go hand in hand, and where there's a massive mobilization, massive investment in the kinds of clean energy solutions that we need. It could be inclusive of a carbon tax. The designers have said that, absolutely. But it wouldn't just be that.
Okay, yeah, good. This is an interesting question about advocacy, because I think advocating for particular action is something from a scientist standpoint. Oftentimes scientists shy away from advocacy. And I'm kind of curious, this is a question for I think Andrea and you, Pete, in being a witness in this case, or have witnesses in this case, I should say, feared for their credibility as scientists because they're seen as advocating for particular positions?
We haven't seen that at all, but most of our experts are seasoned veterans. But I do remember I was driving in a car with Jim Hansen from Eugene to Portland to go to the airport a long time ago. I mean, maybe 9 years ago when we were just starting the campaign. And I remember him talking about the struggle and challenge as a scientist to become an advocate, because that was sort of when he was transitioning to become more of an advocate. And I think he struggled with that tremendously, because scientists are scientists. They want to work with the facts and the data. And so he took actually time off after he testified in Congress and went back to his lab and, put his head down and got back into the planetary science. So I think, it is a struggle. But we have the luxury of asking our scientists to just tell it like it is. We are not defense counsel who say, tell these facts, but not these facts. They just need to tell the story. And while it's wonderful for us, for our litigation, it's perilous for the planet. It's a very tragic story, scientific story that we are putting ourselves playing a role in. So, and that's part of being on the plaintiff's bar. We just want our witnesses to tell the truth. They can't say it's 100% certain. They can't say that, there won't be anomalies. They just can't say that. They just need to do their best to communicate. And to be honest with you, at this point in time, the situation is so dire. My impression from the experts that we work with is they want the world to know. They don't want to keep this information within their laboratories. And I'm even seeing that with young scientists who are just coming up and don't have secure funding. And they want the world to know about their work. And I think part of that has to do with our government's efforts to suppress science and the scientific method. So that's been the experience that we see. And we have to support science and the scientific method, and we try to do that as lawyers. Sometimes we want them to say something, and they won't say it because it's not supported by the science, and we have to accept that.
Yeah, from a personal perspective, being a scientist involved in this case, I mean, the facts are absolutely on the side of this issue and on this case, so it's really not difficult from that perspective. But I would just encourage anyone out here in the audience who's a scientist, don't be afraid to get involved and speak up on these kind of things. There's not time. There are actually empirical studies about people's credibility in speaking up. And they show very little downside to people's careers of getting involved in advocacy. And that is changing, I think, in a positive direction even more.
All right. Well, I really do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I have a ton of cards up here, and I apologize. We don't have time to get through them right now. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and realize that we are already over time. So let's give a big round of applause for our panelists. These guys are phenomenal. They're doing the hard work, and they definitely deserve the applause. We could go on for minutes, I'm sure. I told you we could. I do want to close with a couple of important points before I allow you guys to just ask your questions individually of our panelists. A couple of things. Cascadia Climate Action puts on this event, and Cascadia Climate Action is all about, as the name implies, action. I really do strongly encourage you all to check out the Cascadia Climate Action website and learn about how you can get involved. The website has just a myriad ways for you to get involved at the local, state, and federal level, so please check it out. Upcoming hearings, upcoming events. It's a great clearinghouse for information, so please check that out. So do get informed, get involved as well. We've got a lot of really great groups here tonight. We've got Carbon Washington over there. Raise your hands, guys. Carbon Washington. Greg Rock from Carbon Washington's over there. He gave me a note card, which I will try to read to you. They have a very important action item, action alert right now, and they're looking for people to just donate a little bit of their time, 3 minutes for a phone call tomorrow to support the Sustainable Farms and Fields Bill, Senate Bill 5947. It's being heard in the Ways and Means Committee. These senators need to hear from their constituents. If you want to learn more about how you can take action today, tomorrow, to make a difference, please go and talk to Greg with Carbon Washington. He's waving his arms, and he just don't care. All right. Also, Citizens Climate Lobby, they're over there. There they are. Talk to them about their important work and get involved. We got the Public Comment Project over there. Raise your hand. Talk to them about how you can provide public comment. They've got great tools and tricks on how you can provide your comment as a member of the public. So talk to them. Helene is sitting right next door. Helene is with a group trying to develop a petition for a Nobel Prize for climate change or for climate action. So sign that petition and talk to Helene about that. And lastly, Cascadia Climate Action, we've got a table over here with just some simple ways that you can take action today to help fight climate change. So please check that out as well. Andrea didn't talk about this too much, but youth The youthvgov.org website has a whole list of toolkits, things that you can take and use to start taking action to support the case that she's a part of. I went ahead and put that up there so you could, it's a very simple URL. Check that out. If you want to get involved in the classroom, if you want to help organize, if you want to help table, there are tools for you to do those things. So check that out as well. You can also take action with the Global Youth Climate Strike. Yeah, let's hear it for the climate strike. You can do this. 10 to 1, Friday, March 15th, Cal Anderson Park. Please, it's open to everybody. Go down there and show your support. Also, join us next time. If you enjoyed this event, please come out and support us in the future. The UW Program on Climate Change graduate students have started a Schooner series. Get that, Climate on Tap, Schooner series, kind of play on words. They've got an event coming up March 14th at Flying Bike. It's going to be fun. It's going to be an opportunity for them to talk about what gets them motivated. It's going to be not dry science. It's going to be fun stuff. So please come out and support them as they work to expand their science communication skills. And then March 27th, Climate Science on Tap, Climate Science in the Capitol. We'll be back here to talk about climate science down in the State House. So put that on your calendars as well. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here tonight. Thanks to our panelists again, Andrea, Pete, Steve. Let's hear it for them again. Thank you so much, guys. And I also want to thank our volunteers, the Cascadia Climate Action volunteers. Raise your hand if you're volunteering. Our volunteers, let's hear it for our volunteers. They're around here as well. And then finally, Optimism Brewing Company for having us here. They open up their space for us. They provide us with tasty beer. Please take a second to thank them for giving us this space and you know, have another beer while you're at it, all right? So again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. We're going to stick around, talk to our tablers, talk to our panelists, get your questions answered, and start that conversation because it's so important for our future. All right, thank you.